Now, he may well be exaggerating, but since there are images of even mundane things like golden tweezers, the fact that gold would then be used to make tweezers, that shows that it's not a far stretch of the imagination for Herodotus to say that gold would then be used to enchain prisoners.
Many of the things that we think of as advanced culture or advanced technology has its root within Kemet.
We know that pottery was first used in Sudan rather than in Egypt.
The Kushites throughout their whole history were always very good at making pottery. They were very artistic, and their pottery is some of the best in the ancient world. That was also manufactured at Meroe.
This is the great glory of Meroe, the pottery. Much of this has been conserved and restored. What's extraordinary is how thin they're able to make this pottery and how they choose every tradition open to them.
What's amazing here is this pottery is over 2,500 years old, and much of it is still usable today.
This is much more an Egyptian form. That's a little baby feeding cup. That's just the mud of the Nile.
Now, the last ruler, Shepenupet II, was on the throne when the Assyrians conquered Egypt. They made their conquest in 663 BC.
When the last of the Nubian kings, Tawentameni, fought his last conflict with Ashurbanipal, who was the Assyrian king in 664 BCE, we see Kemet being split from the African world, or an attempt to split Kemet from the African world. As the subsequent more barbarous invaders took control of Egypt, the kings of Kush were afraid that their central kingdom would be attacked, would be destroyed. So they moved their capital from Napata to Meroe, which is why Meroe grows when Napata declines.
The kings moved their burial ground, their pyramids, to Meroe, and perhaps they moved the capital city even earlier, around 500–600 BC.
So this dividing line that was set up by the Kushite kings was a matter of defense, a matter of safety.
After this, there are no more black rulers of Egypt. The rulers are now Assyrians, or Assyrian puppets.
And essentially the northern part of Kemet became part of the culture and history and civilization of Assyria. Assyria became the focal point, the married line, the feminine line, the female line of Kemet was deliberately usurped by the Assyrian kings.
And therefore Shepenupet II was the last independent black ruler of Egypt.
As the Assyrian kings took control of Kemet, then we have a resurgence in consciousness in Nubia. The Kushite people, the Nubian people in the south, resurged because after 664, perhaps by 590 BCE, there were no further attempts by the Nubians, by the Kushites, to retake Kemet. That's why Meroe had a second renaissance. It had a renaissance before, but that's why it had a second renaissance, because the Kushite kings, the Nubian kings, were no longer trying to take back Kemet. That's why the Meroitic script was resurged.
Now, during the time of Kushite pharaoh Natasen, the Kushites invent this script, which scholars call Meroitic.
And interestingly, they also borrowed from Egyptians the signs for writing their language.
But let's be quite clear, Egyptian hieroglyphics themselves date back to the Tarseti period, which is the first golden age of Nubia. So if we wanted to trace the origin of Egyptian hieroglyphics, we have to go back to very early Nubia.
Basically, for the longest time in Kushite history that we find evidence of writing, they were using the same hieroglyphs as the Egyptians were using. Both cultures used the same. But later on, when the kingdom became more centered in Meroe, they devised their own script.
But they borrow 23 hieroglyphic signs and a number of other demotic signs to write in their own language, which is the second oldest written language in Africa, Meroitic language.
They actually devised two scripts. One is known as the cursive script, and the other one is known now as the Meroitic hieroglyphs.
The script had 23 letters, of which 19 were consonants and 4 were vowels. There was also a word divider, so scholars know when the words began, when the words ended.
And it's only partly deciphered, so there's lots of mysteries in the work.
And there are 900 books and inscriptions written in this old script.
In terms of understanding the language, it hasn't been translated yet, and so that really hampers our understanding of the culture and the religion, and basically how the people saw themselves and what they'd like to say about themselves. There are a couple of people who are trying to decipher the language, and one of the ways that they wanted to do it was to speak to people who today speak what may have been a related language.
Time is running out because a lot of the languages of Africa are not spoken by more than literally sometimes a dozen people. And as the elders die and people don't capture these languages, we won't have that link. People in the landscape won't know what the sound was.
It appears that the Nubian Kushites created this new language to protect the last of their secrets from the invading foreigners. In doing so, they created a greater divide between them and their lost gem of the Nile Valley, Egypt.
Then Egypt is conquered by the Persians in 525 BC.
The Persian kings, like Cambyses, a ruthless and genocidal ruler who took over Persian rulership and then took over rulership in Kemet. This Cambyses attempted to invade Nubia and failed. His army died in the Nubian desert. That which was left was destroyed by the Nubian bows. If you don't know, then you should know that the Nubians were famous for having the longbow. Even before the 14th century Englishman said he created a longbow. I don't know how he came out with creating the English longbow. The longbow was the famous weapon of choice for the Nubian, the Kushite warriors.
Then it's conquered by the Greeks in 332 BC.
Then, of course, after the Battle of Gargamella, in 323 or 325 BCE, Alexander the Great, a Greek, a Macedonian, defeated Darius III. In defeating Darius III, Alexander the Great then became a pharaoh of Egypt.
He took charge of Egypt, which is what we get the name from the ancient Greeks. That's what they called the country.
So the Egyptian world becomes part then of the Greek world.
And following his death, when his kingdom, which was so big it had to be divided up amongst his generals, a general called Ptolemy took charge of Egypt, and initially as a satrap, as an official who was ruling there, and then later as a king.
The Macedonian rulerships, Ptolemy, etc., who was a Macedonian Greek general, married into the Egyptian bloodline. Married into the female Egyptian bloodline, producing Egyptians who are Greek and Egyptian at the same time and facing towards Greece.
And he founded really the last resident dynasty of pharaohs.
So then Egypt then became even more divorced. And then, of course, there is the classic story. Whether or not there is historical accuracy to it is another matter, although we do have references to it, of Alexander's attempt to invade Nubia and the Candace Amerinus with elephants and warriors preventing him from invading Nubia. We have that recorded under several Greek scholars. The Macedonian rulers of Egypt did not conquer Nubia. Nubia remained essentially intact.
The Greeks had had a lot of contact with Kemet, and they saw Kemet as a place where they would go to learn. So many of the famous Greek philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, playwrights, all went to Egypt to actually learn from the Egyptian priests.
The Greek rulership did not affect the religious systems in the same way that Christianity and Islam did.
The Romans started to interfere with Egypt about 100 BC. And that was because this Ptolemaic dynasty, the dynasty Cleopatra was the last ruler of that dynasty, had started to have a lot of dynastic feuds. So brothers and sisters had been sort of arguing and vying for the throne one person would be exiled, somebody else would take control. And the Romans were starting to become increasingly powerful, and quite often the ruler who'd been exiled would actually run to the Romans and ask them to put them back on the throne.
Then it's conquered by the Romans in 30 BC.
For the Greeks and Romans, the Egyptians were Africans, and when you get depictions of Egyptians, they're always shown people with black skin, afro hair, sort of small noses, broad faces, full mouths. So they actually sort of have a caricature almost of what they see as an Egyptian. And the Greeks often confused Egypt with Ethiopia, so they'll quite often call the Egyptians Ethiopians. So it's obviously somebody with a dark face. And when they showed Ethiopians, they showed them in exactly the same way that they showed Egyptians as Africans. So there was no question at all that Egypt was an African country. It certainly wasn't seen to be European by either the Greeks or the Romans.
Now, the Romans and the Greeks and the Assyrians and the Persians came to Egypt because Egypt was the breadbasket of the world. The control of Egypt and the granaries of Egypt was fundamental to the control of any civilization that attempted to control the world. Not only that, but Egypt, through its trade relations with the South, had control and access to the minerals of the South: the iron, the copper, the gold, the silver.